Now that we know that he existed, what characteristics identify him, and have a rough idea of where he was worshipped, we can start trying to figure out what sort of god he was. We'll start with the torque. Cernunnos is so strongly associated with those Celtic neck rings that he might almost be called the god of torques as appropriately as the antlered god. Other deities may wear them and sometimes hold them, but Cernunnos almost always wears one, and not only that, but holds one, or has one in his lap, or in the case of Notre Dame, has one hanging from each antler. What does a torque mean? It's sometimes said to be a sign of divinity, but there are two problems with this. First, there are images of Gaulish deities that aren't wearing torques. Secondly, there are images of non-deities wearing torques, such as the famous dying Gaul. The impression that they are signs of divinity may be skewed by the relative lack of Gaulish images that aren't of deities. So what do they mean? Most likely they are a sign of wealth and power, two things that were as inseparable in ancient Gaul as in the modern world. Many of them were made of gold or silver, and would have been worth a good deal. Even those of iron or bronze would have been expensive. It is just this that I believe the torques of Cernunnos to have symbolized, not divinity or the less specific idea of power, but wealth, in particular wealth created by human effort, wealth derived from culture. That the meaning as wealth is emphasized by the torque having been replaced by purses in images such as those of Reims and Vendôme. Now let's turn to the ram-headed snake. This is a peculiar animal, but not one peculiar to Cernunnos, being found elsewhere. Note that in two of these examples it is associated with a warrior god. Remember that we've also seen it twice in the Gundestrup cauldron besides the one in the Cernunnos panel, in one case with a thunder god. It is however closely connected with Cernunnos, and is almost diagnostic of him. It has therefore attracted a lot of attention by those trying to figure out what sort of god Cernunnos was. This attention is focused mainly on why these two animals. Of all the animals that can be combined with a snake, why a ram? One suggestion has been that a sheep is particularly connected with sacrifice. Even if this is so, and I don't think it has been simply stated as fact, with little evidence presented to support it. And if it were true, what would be the reason behind its use here? Others have suggested that it is specifically connected with the underworld, but the pig is far more often found in that sense. Determining the meaning of the ram-headed snake takes us surprisingly far afield. It will show us that it is not too idiosyncratic to. It is in fact found as far away in space and time as China in the Shang and Zhou dynasties, which extend from circa 1600 BCE to 256 BCE. Here we see it on a bronze ritual vessel, and here it is on two others. I don't think this is a coincidence, but we have to show how it got to Gaul. The answer is via the Silk Road. We know that the Gauls had access to silk at a very early period. The Hochdorf chieftain from 530 BCE was buried in a silk garment. It wasn't just silk that traveled on the road, however. Artistic motifs made their way too. Among these were snakes with animal heads. Here we see a Scythian bridle depicting a woman whose legs are snakes that terminate in lions' heads. We can get a lot closer to Cernunnos' ram-headed snake, though. This greave is a startling find. Like the Gundestrup cauldron, it is Thracian and repoussé gilt silver. It has the same ivy leaves in the background. The similarities are astounding. It's as if the two were made by the same artist, or at least one in the same artistic tradition. Yet here we find the ram-headed serpent unconnected with Cernunnos. The face on the greave may or may not represent a deity, but the serpents seem to be there solely for artistic reasons. So to return to our questions, why does Cernunnos hold a snake, and why a ram-headed one? To answer both questions, we need to look at how snakes were viewed in ancient times. In many cultures, the fact that they lived underground connected them with the underworld. If we look specifically at the Indo-European belief system to which the Celts belonged, we see snakes considered to be ambiguous. They move without legs, thereby breaking the rules. They are covered with scales like fish, again breaking the rules by being in a way water animals that live on land. By being ambiguous, they were being anomalous. They did not fit into any category and therefore could be seen as opponents of order. Indo-Europeans were all about order, so snakes could be seen as bad, even evil. This evil of the snake is seen most clearly in the serpent-killing myth. I've touched on this earlier with the storm god panel from the Gundestrup cauldron. A storm god kills a great serpent with his lightning and thunder throwing weapon, often with the help of a mortal. This snake is in the possession of treasures, which are usually expressed as the fertilizing waters, women, or cows. In Indo-European societies, wealth was measured in cattle. In fact, the English word pecuniary, meaning to have to do with money, comes eventually from Proto-Indo-European pep, cattle. Women, via exogamous marriages, were a way to bind society together. Water was necessary for the production of food. In later medieval times, the wealth-withholding serpent becomes the dragon who hoards gold rather than letting it circulate. The serpent is therefore preventing the growth of crops, society, and wealth. Thus he must be killed, and this is done by the rain-giving storm god. This makes a connection with a war god understandable. The serpent is a source of treasure which is won by defeating it. The serpent-slaying myth depicted on this panel is one way of doing that. Cernunnos is showing us another way. Instead of killing the serpent, he has taken it under his control. He may grasp it in his hands, as on the Gundestrup cauldron. He may feed it, becoming its domesticator. One may rise up on either side as if to do him homage. However it is done, he is the master of the snake, but not by killing it. Rather, he brings it under his control and thereby becomes master of the wealth it provides. But why is it ram-headed? What is it about this snake that would cause a Thracian silversmith to use this motif from his repertoire? As I've said, snakes are ambiguous. For instance, the terrestrial Indo-European snake could also live in the water. This may be indicated by the fishtails and the Atong Su'aru's images snakes. Changing the snake's head to that of a ram is another way of representing this. Not only do we have the ambiguous snake, it has been made even more ambiguous by being combined with another animal, and not just any animal, but a ram, a member of a species that existed in both domesticated and wild forms, an ambiguous species. The ram-headed snake is therefore ambiguity squared, perhaps even cubed. Or maybe it's simpler. Maybe the Celt commissioning the Gundestrup cauldron just said, I want him holding a snake and make sure it's a scary one, and the Silk Road-inspired silversmith said, no problem, I've got just the thing, and then dipped into his repertoire for a demonized serpent. By holding the ram-headed serpent, Cernunnos is therefore in control of the treasure-providing serpent who lives underground. How about the crossed legs? This pose is found almost exclusively with Cernunnos, but not completely so. There are cross-legged images from southern Gaul that possibly represent ancestors. There is this image from Kili that does not depict Cernunnos. We have seen some images that are cross-legged, but that neither lack other elements that would identify them as Cernunnos, nor possess any that would disqualify them, not because they never could have had them, but because if they did, the characteristics have been lost through damage. There is a good probability that these represent Cernunnos, but it is not a sure thing. This means that the cross-legged position could have been associated with a number of deities. It would be odd, though, if none of the images of those deities survived except for unidentifiable ones. I'm therefore going to consider it as a characteristic of Cernunnos, even if not a necessary one, since there are standing versions. Perhaps the most common explanation for the crossed legs is Diodorus Siculus' comment that the Celts sat on the ground. This explanation won't fly, however, since many of the Gaulish deities whose images survive are sitting in chairs, including ones which accompany Cernunnos. In fact, Cernunnos himself can be shown as sitting on a platform, and even in a chair. To get around this, it has been suggested that Cernunnos was quintessentially Celtic, identified with the dis pater that Ceisiwr tells us the Gauls believed themselves to be descended from, and thus was shown in a typical Celtic sitting mode. This seems to me to be trying too hard, and would at least require evidence that Cernunnos was dis pater, something that's weak, being limited to the Sant group and the Raditurims. Perhaps, another suggestion has been made, he was a hunting deity, sitting the way hunters do in the forest. I've already made it clear, however, that it is inaccurate to think of him as a hunting god. The position has sometimes been treated as if it were a yogic position, or in some other way influenced by Eastern religious practice. It's sometimes called the Buddha position, the Buddha-Haltung, both influencing and being influenced by this idea. Identifying the position by a term identified with Eastern religion has led to some look for its origin there. There is, however, no evidence among the Celts of the sort of positions involved in either Buddhism or Hatha Yoga, making this connection unlikely. Others have noticed that on the Gundestrup cauldron, Cernunnos' legs are not in fact crossed. In fact, they aren't on any pre-Roman image. They have therefore interpreted him as dancing. We don't know much about the use of dance in Indo-European religion, and it would be taking an excessive leap to assume that that's what we have here. I suggest that the reason for the position is a far more prosaic one. To explain it, I will have to go back to Val Camonica. In the valley there are rock drawings that show a combined stag and man. Note that in one of these the human part is like the busts we have already seen from the valley and from the Gundestrup cauldron, and which seem to indicate divinity. The other image is more interesting. Here the stag has been transfixed by a human figure, which is shown completely, that is, in a fashion unusual for Val Camonican deities. Even with the bust version, the stag is shown completely. The combined stag man is standing. This continues in the 4 Val Camonica Cernunnos images. The god is shown standing and in full form. We can conclude from this that there was a tradition to represent Cernunnos with a complete body and standing, probably as a continuation of the full-formed and standing stagman. We now turn to the Gundestrup cauldron, Cernunnos' first post-Camonican appearance. Almost all the figures that can be considered divine there are in the bust form. The only possible exception is the person in the dunking scene, who may well be a priest. That person, and Cernunnos that is. Again we see a standard of representing Cernunnos' entire body. This presented the artist with a problem. A completely bodied Cernunnos would have small proportions in the limited space, especially when his antlers were taken into account, and even more so when compared with the other divine figures. Since only half of them had to be represented, they could be considerably larger than the equivalent part of Cernunnos' body. The answer to this problem was easy: to bend Cernunnos' legs. This would have given the space for him to have a large body. Note that his legs are not actually crossed. In fact, they aren't particularly close to being crossed. I've already suggested that Cernunnos was introduced to the West via the Gundestrup cauldron or its artistic tradition. I believe that the crossed legs of the Western images were based on a misinterpretation of the Gundestrup cauldron's version. This turned a standing Cernunnos from Vel Camonica into the Western cross-legged sitting god, giving the Gundestrup cauldron the status of a transitional fossil.